thing we all know about web development is that we can't trust the user. Okay, the user can be anybody, someone who wants to destroy our database, or someone who just has clean intentions and might make mistakes that will give us disastrous consequences. In this video, we're going to be talking about validation in Laravel. Okay, so let's jump straight into it. Remember, when we visit our create new post and we submit the form, it goes right there and it already submits, and we need to check and make sure that this data that we're receiving is actually the data that we want to store in our database. So we're going to cross-check and make sure that the data we're receiving from our form is in the right format and ready to be inserted in our database. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to do this in our post controller, and I'd like to show you something. Our post controller extends the base controller, and this controller here is right here. So in this controller.php, you see we have use authorizes requests, use dispatches jobs, and use validates requests. Okay, so it uses this thread called validates requests, and this thread has a bunch of methods that are going to help us. And the one we need in this case is the validate method. So since this class right here actually uses that thread, we're going to call the method. So we'll say this validate. Okay, and this validate method, first of all, it receives the data we're trying to validate. Okay, so the validate is going to receive the request. So it's receiving the current request, and you receive an array. So first it's receiving the request, and second is receiving an array of the rules that we want to use to validate. Okay, so first thing is that we know we need a title. So we'll say in the validation, in the request that we just received, there must be a title field, and these are the rules. We say it must be required, and the next rule will be separated using a pipe, and right here we can say a maximum of 255 characters. Okay, so Laravel provides us with a bunch of helpful rules that we're going to be using to validate our data. Okay, the next thing is that right here we're going to put in the next field. Okay, so there we have a featured field. So I'll say featured, and I'll make sure that this is required, and I'll make sure that it's an image. So we also have an image validation rule to make sure that this field right here is an image. Okay, the next thing is that right here we need to set our content and make sure that we have a content. So we'll say it's required, and that is going to be the only validation rule. We can also go ahead and remove this, but just know that if you're trying to pass in many validation rules, you use a pipe. So this now is being validated. Let's remove this and try to see what happens when we submit our form with blank entries. So let's go back, I refresh, and I submit. You see we're redirected back to this page, and guess what? When we are redirected back to this page, we have a bunch of errors that came back with the request, but we can't see the errors right now because obviously we need to display the errors. Okay, so how do we see the errors from our validation in our controller? Let's head over to our view, and in our admin/create.blade.php, right here where we have the content, we are going to insert the logic to see these errors. So we'll just put that in an if statement, and we'll say errors, and this errors variable right here is a variable that is available to all our views, and this errors is going to be empty if there are no errors in validation, and it's going to have data if we just returned from a validation, for example this one in our post controller. So if this validation fails, that errors variable is populated and we have access to it in our view. So let's head over to our create.blade, and right here what we'll be doing is actually checking if this error has data. If it has data, then we want to actually output that data for the user to see and correct. So how are we going to be doing this? Since this is an array, we can use a method called count. And this count method is going to make sure that it counts the number of objects or elements that we have in this errors array. So we'll just say if the count of these errors is greater than 0, so it means the number of elements in this errors array is greater than 0, then we're going to do something. So what we'll be doing here is displaying an unordered list of errors. So we'll say list group And inside this list group, we're gonna have a loop. Okay, so at for each right here, and what are we looping through? All the errors. Okay, so remember this is an array, but we need to get all the errors. Okay, so it's gonna give us access to all the errors, and we'll just say loop through them as error. Okay, so right here we're making sure that the count is greater than 0, and right here we get all the errors and we loop through them. Okay, so right here and for each, and for each of those errors in the validated errors array, just echo out a new list item of list group item and of text danger, and right inside that list item you're gonna echo out the error that we got. Okay, so right here that's what we have. If the number of errors inside the errors array is greater than 0, create another list, and for each of those errors, echo out the error in a list item for our user to see. Okay, so let's refresh. Now the errors are gone, but let's store again, and you discover now we have the text field is required, the featured field is required, the content field is required. How cool is that? Okay, so now we're receiving validation errors. Now let's go ahead and fill in these fields. We'll say some title, and we'll put in this, and we'll insert an image, we'll insert a document which is actually not an image, and see what happens. Okay, so I gotta find something that's not an image. Anything that's not an image. Okay, so I'll go with this one, and I'll store the post. And right here you see the featured must be an image. Okay, so the featured must be an image, so it means this field must be an image. So you see our validation is working. So let's head over to our post controller, and we'll say if the validation passes, then just die dump the request all. Okay, so now how's this gonna look? We'll fill in the form, some title, we'll upload some image, and we'll put in some content, and we store the post. Okay, so this looks like it's not gonna recognize that it's an image. Why? Because there's something we omitted in our form. Okay, so obviously when we're trying to submit forms, we must specify the enc type to be multi-part form data. Okay, so that HTML5 is gonna recognize that there's a file, and it's also gonna upload it. Okay, so now that we've corrected that, hopefully Laravel is gonna be able to validate that field to tell us if it's an image or not. So let's upload a correct image and store the post, and okay, a validation passes, and there we receive an instance of the uploaded file.